everybody has a problem with abuse, but at the hands of another person. But I think it's, borderline abusive to sort of be talking and introducing ideas to people who are not yet at an age to understand.
Professor Mark Regnerus, it's such a joy that you can join us today. I'll tell you why it's a particular joy. I mean, we're going to talk in a minute a little bit about cheap sex and its impact on marriage, and you've written extensively around the subject of marriage and sexuality and all sorts of things. Professor, University of Texas, and you've had lots of roles and you published lots of books and lots of articles and things. I think the ideological phrase would be I'm stoked to talk to you, and I think that's fitting from a US perspective, simply because I think you're one of the people whose writing is going to make a difference, because you do touch on the stuff that not a lot of other people are willing to touch on, and we don't need to go into it today, but you've been through the fire because of doing that, and people get together and say we don't like your research because but we just don't like it. It's actually quite robust, and the things you say are quite relevant, but people don't like to hear it. So good for you. Now, before we go any further, just say hi to our listeners and our viewers so they can hear your voice, and it's not just me talking all the time.
Hello. I don't do a lot of podcasts, but when you write, I'm like, okay, I should try to squeeze that one in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for that. I mean, and you should do more, because the opportunity is you've got a lot to say and you've got robust evidence behind everything you say. It's not just opinion. It's robustly thought out and robustly articulated, and that's what I really like about your work. And we're going to discuss something, a book which I read of yours just a couple of weeks ago, which you wrote a few years ago now, Cheap Sex. I think you wrote it 7 years ago, but actually it's as prescient today as you'd expect, as it was when you wrote it back then. Absolutely timeless, and the research in it is really timeless. Nothing's changed. In fact, maybe it's more necessary. And before I do that, just if anybody's watching for the first time, of course, we are Coalition for Marriage. We're the UK's leading pro-marriage group. We represent tens of thousands of individuals from all faiths and none, Mark. So all sorts of different people. Happen to be a Christian myself, my board are Christians, but we approach the conversation about the benefits of man-woman marriage as something unique and special in society. We kind of approach that from a secular evidence base, because the evidence is pretty abundantly clear that you need to support that and promote that, because it's a good thing for everyone, including the people who don't actually support or like that. But anyway, that's who we are, and that's why you're of interest to me, and that's why this idea of cheap sex is quite interesting, because marriage, we know statistically fewer people are getting married. The ones that are getting married much later in life, and they're having fewer children, etc., etc., etc. And what we do about that is an interesting thing, because there is a kind of population problem ahead of us. People tell us not enough young people to pay taxes to keep the older people and keep the economy going. That means you have to import people from overseas, and all sorts of different, ramifications which are way beyond our remit. The thing you raise in Cheap Sex is the fact that there's been a change. There's been a fundamental change, because now men can get sex very easily, right? You can get it on Tinder. You can go and find a partner quite easily, or you can go and get most of what you want from pornography online very, very easily. It's a click away, costs you nothing financially. And so you can satisfy or gratify. And equally, women, well, they can go and earn a job now. They don't need a man to provide them with resources. Society seems to be a lot safer these days. You don't need somebody protecting you all the time. And this difference between men and women, which might have been there in an office environment, very hard to tell. You need to go to a gym these days to see the difference between men and women primarily, or a building site. So that's a fundamental kind of shift in society. Yet you say the exchange model is still applicable, i.e., sex in return for a man's, protection, etc., etc. So is it? I mean, let's start there. The exchange model. What is it, and is it still applicable at all in society?
Right. The exchange model is pretty old, obviously, but it's just the kind of idea that the relationship between a man and woman in love, married, or not really, hinges on the exchange of things that the other person wants or needs, right? And so, and it can be simplified a little bit around the idea that, oh, men give uh, love to get sex, women give sex to get love. That's a bit too simplified because it's not all about just sort of the traffic in emotion or physical gratification. It's that he does certain things for her and she does certain things for him that they either couldn't do without each other or more likely, takes effort or frankly, who wants to do it all for themselves all the time, right? And so the Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker kind of articulated this a little bit more explicitly back, I think, in the 1970s. But he's just tracking something that's very old. And I'd say the past 20 years, people have dismissed it, scholars, etc., saying, well, it's just not like that anymore. I'm not so sure that that's true because when you actually dig down and look at the relationship between man and woman, you start to see traces of this still, right? So yes, she doesn't need his provision as much anymore, but she still wants it, right? I mean, it's pretty unusual for a woman to take very seriously as a potential partner or spouse a man who does not have a job or has a difficult time keeping a job. So there's this understanding that a man provides, right? That's what they do. Even if I don't need the provision, he still provides, right? And it's still very old that men do desire to have sex with their spouse, right? With their partner. It doesn't matter. I mean, girlfriend, they are seeking this from her. And she might say, oh, her interests in sex are just as strong as his. That can be true on an individual basis here and there, but it's not going to be true consistently across entire group, not by a long shot. So there are still things that men and women desire from each other that uh, that they cannot get as quickly or as simply as they can without that person, right? So even when you've got two professionals who have successful jobs, who seem to act similarly, might even look similarly, there is still within that union some giving and taking of things that they feel less adept at, right? People trade on their weaknesses and their strengths. They just do. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon, even while we think of men and women as more or less interchangeable.
Yeah, and it's still the case, isn't it, that women, if you look at it statistically, tend to marry up. So they want somebody who's doing better than themselves financially, etc., etc.
They can't marry down and him not be working,
Yep.
right? And you also see this in the case of the kind of stay-at-home dads.
Mm.
They exist. They are not numerous. And I can't really picture a time when they will become numerous.
And even statistically, if the woman is earning more than the man, there's a greater risk of divorce. That's just stats.
Statistically so. It's just, you might say, oh, it shouldn't have to be that way. Lots of these things in this domain, we could say, oh, it shouldn't be that way, but it is, right? And I want to traffic in reality, not strictly ideals all the time.
And then you make the point because you go into the stats about who's having sex with who and how prolific it is, and actually it turns out it's a small number of people. It's not everybody. It's it's a small number of people. But then you also make the distressing point that different men look for different types of women. So the sort of women they want for a one night stand are the very different sort of woman that they might want for wife material. And you make the point in the book that women need to realize this, that the idea of having fun with men actually and it building you up and making you think you're this, that, or the other. Actually, the stats say that men want to settle down with a woman who hasn't done that.
Yeah. I open the story of the book with a story of this woman who had moved from Brooklyn to Austin. And, so much about her account kind of characterizes our situation. She was educated, but wasn't making as much money as she wanted. She could easily go out with men that she met online. She tended to sleep with them either after the first date or maybe the second or third date. And she continually regrets doing so, but doesn't seem to understand how to not make it so. She wants to be married. She wants to have children. As last time I checked, she is neither married nor has children. And that's probably 8+ years ago that I talked to her, and she was already well over 30. So in some ways, the life she wanted, she has not gotten, but didn't want it so bad as to kind of follow the consistently predictable trail of getting there. One of which was sort of she was, a toy to the men in her life. I'm not sure she realized it. Some women don't seem to get that how men perceive them if they're easy is just sort of they'll be happy to spend time with you until they decide that they want to spend time with somebody else, right? Marriage, I mean, I think it's off the table from the get-go because men understand like, well, I'm going to marry because I want to commit to someone and I want them to commit to me. And she didn't commit it. I mean, she gave me her body with, at very little cost, right? It was cheap. And so he worries that, well, is that going to be the same thing in the future, right? She can worry about that being the same thing in the future for him, and he's a consistent risk of that, right? But I think men out there are probably not used to policing their wife, or at least thinking they ought to, right? But we're entering a world where, the kind of the rise of polyamory, we're not relating to each other in the kinds of ways that men and women historically say they wish to do so. Sex is cheap. I mean, that's the point of the book. It's made cheap because of the uptake of artificial contraception, which basically plunged the price of sex because pregnancy is super expensive as a life experience. So it leveled the playing field with women and men in some ways, right? She could have sex like him, but she doesn't really want to have sex like him. And all of a sudden, the thing he was willing to pay for through effort, hard work, money, labors, etc., he didn't really have to pay for it anymore or pay very little. So you've got the sort of plunging uh, price of sex because of the higher quality of pornography. It more closely mimics real sex. Uh, and then online dating, which you can cycle through people super quick compared to, when I met my wife, there was one woman in my orbit who might have gone on a date with me, and that was it.
Mm, mm. So about the price of sex, then it's often said that women set the price for sex, and if that's a swipe on an app, well, so be it. Or if that's long-term faithful relationship, so be that too. But then, is it almost is it almost because of the pressures of porn and et cetera, et cetera, are they having to reduce the price for that? And what's from an academic's perspective, somebody who knows about their economics, what's the advice there? What's the advice to women generally?
Women don't set the price of sex, at least not by themselves. They gauge what's going on in their environment. They talk more about sex with their girlfriends in the sense of like trying to understand, not in sort of a straightforward manner typically, but sort of what people are doing out there and when and how is it working out for them. And men don't do that because they really don't need to. They're often not, they don't want to know what other men are up to. They just kind of know what they want and when. So it's women who basically they don't set the price. The price is set communally, typically speaking.
And that's a good point you make. You make that point very well in the book, actually.
Yeah, it's more important for the woman to understand this because she, in the end, does set the price. Okay. She has to discern it. But then, she has to decide, am I going to sleep with him after this date or not? Right? Is this the first date, third date, fourth date, third month, sixth month, ninth month? Have they talked about this? What do they hope from each other? but the price can always be renegotiated down. It's very difficult to renegotiate it up once it's been set, right? Once it's very difficult to say, hey, I think we made a mistake. I really want to date you for the long run. Let's reset the boundaries. It can be done, not simple at all, and pretty uncommon.
And you make the point also, there's so many points you make in the book that we haven't got time for all of them, but you talk about the fact that monogamy will survive. So you touched on the polyamory thing a moment ago, and actually, is it just something which is more an obsession in the media and a few people rather than more of a general thing? But according to you, monogamy will survive. And you think, well, why should it? I mean, if you know, if couples are okay with that sort of thing, which the media will tell us more and more couples are.
Yeah, I mean, monogamy will survive. Partly because it does signal the power of women. Women have great power over men in the domain of relationships and then the relationship marketplace. They just don't have power alone. They have to have power together, right? You know, they can set the price collectively, notably higher than they do currently. It's difficult though, but it's hard for one woman to sort of set the price high by herself and expect to get it from any man she interacts with. I've known women who have done that, and man after man after man, it's like, I totally respect your boundaries, etc. I just can't go there. And they move on, and she's frustrated and disappointed. But, and I'm not telling her to adjust her standards. It's just that it works on a monopoly, really, than it does one on one.
And you make, just jumping around, a whole load of really interesting points in the book. First of all, you notice a correlation between porn use and support for same-sex marriage, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. It really doesn't shock. And I'm not the only one who's seen that. It's one of those things where I might have been pretty early in saying it, and people are like, "Oh, what a bigot you are, Rignaris." But then, I say, "Hey, dude, look at the data yourself." And everybody sees it, right? I mean, it's nice when data is public because a good analyst can see that this is occurring, right? And it doesn't really surprise. I mean, pornography is invariably wide in its, not only in its distribution, but in its type of content. You can see whatever your, itching eyes want to see. And so this kind of slowly programs your brain to think that, oh, well, there's a lot of different things that are possible. So you can slowly come to accept, like, well, some people do that, some people do that. I'm interested in that, I'm interested in that. And all of a sudden you realize, wow, you're well away from marital monogamy, man or woman. And so it's not surprising that we've seen, obviously, kind of normalization of same-sex marriage, partly because, like, well, it normalized same-sex unions first. Okay. It normalized gay sex and lesbian sex even before that. And then at the end, it's just kind of like, well, whatever people want to do. And so this is why, you start to say, oh, polyamory makes sense because online and pornography, that's what you see, right? This woman and that scene with this man, then another scene with another man, all of a sudden polyamory is in your head as like, well, we'll do it. It's conceivable. It can be done.
You talk about just looking at the evidence, the idea that porn normalizes sex and it also normalizes different types of sex. And then you talk about how that leads to fluidity in sexuality and how, in fact, there's a great deal of fluidity in sexuality. And that seems to me to be a very, very important point, which not enough people are talking about or recognizing or admitting, that actually sexuality is a fluid thing which is influenced by your environments. And that has two major implications. One, it means you're not, this argument, because people are born X or Y in terms of their sexuality, therefore, no, you're saying sex is very fluid. And the other argument is, well, if we can influence people so easily, we need to be pretty careful what we're teaching kids.
Yeah, the fluidity narrative is interesting. Having dabbled in riding around same-sex marriage legislation and contesting that a while
Getting
back.
yourself into trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, it was noteworthy that fluidity was sort of nascent 15 or 20 years ago, just started to kind of being emerge. Uh, I mean, academics had already recognized it, but they realized that the political and legal value of talking of keeping talk about fluidity out of the narrative was pretty helpful because you could then characterize people as, well, people have fixed interests, right? Fixed desires, and how could you criticize somebody for whom this is fixed and inborn? Um, but now, certainly with regard to women, fluidity is understood as academically as common, right? Probably it kind of shocks me at some level that we characterized, um, back to sort of the same-sex marriage battle, like the characterized men and women, uh, lesbian and gay, as basically fundamentally comparable types of people, right? For whom it was always inborn, everything. Like the narrative around this for women has been gone for a long time. Um, it's still, it's clearly the case that homosexuality in men is a bit more rooted. At the same time, we understand that uh, men's minds can change about things. Are you talking about the wiring of their minds? Potentially, right? People talk about pornography as being able to rewire one's brain, which I think is probably the case. What we say to children, what we teach children at what ages, uh, is a very important subject. One of the kind of disappointing things I find is I'm involved in a legal case. Um, and one of the pieces of evidence the opposition is talking about is involves data collection around matters of sexuality from children as young as 10 or 11. And I'm thinking, what was I doing when I was 10 or 11? I was not thinking those thoughts. I knew I liked girls. I was attracted to them. That's about as far as the process went in my head. Uh, but to talk about sexuality on a survey to a 10 or 11-year-old,
Mm.
man, I just get uncomfortable with that. I think it's wrong because it basically takes something that will naturally and socially occur to them in a few years and bring it down several years into a time when, I think it's invasive to do that. Uh, so, I see that. I think, the political left seems to have no problem with that. Um, and yet everybody has a problem. Everybody has a problem with abuse, but at the hands of another person. But I think it's, borderline abusive to sort of be talking and introducing ideas to people who are not yet at an age to understand the meaning of it and to tie it to the mind, to the body. Um, so I also think like it's kind of pointless to ask a 10 or 11-year-old, like, A, they don't know what they're talking about because you've introduced ideas to them that they are not yet formed to understand or have a personal, genuine experience of. And so the data can't be terribly good either. It's an important thing to consider what we are teaching to children and when. So I don't really blame conservatives at all for thinking that, you know what, maybe it's too early to introduce some of these topics, right? And this is also very interesting, bridging to a topic that I'm working on. Uh, the idea of all this information being put upon people early presses younger people to sort of come out of the closet if they think they're gay or lesbian at earlier ages, which puts them in a more vulnerable spot than people used to be in, right? They would come out of the closet, 18, 20, 24. I mean, I think the average age was in the mid 20s, say 50 plus years ago. uh, when people were more mature and able to deal with it. Now your kids are coming out of the closet at age 14, 13, 12, 15, right smack in the period of time when adolescence, um, that can be a brutal culture. And so part of the reason we're seeing this sort of profound surge in depression, anxiety, suicidality among um, teenagers is, well, there's rising percentages of them that are identifying as LGBTQ, whether it's true or not. But it's a terribly social and sensitive time. People will be working this out, right? Much better to be working some of this out socially later. Anyways, just a kind of random observation of linking some of this content to some of our social and political reality today.
Yeah, and then finally, Mark, you a lovely phrase you use in the book. We need to get the old transcendence back again, and thinking about this thing where actually a man and a woman experience something transcendent between each other that lasts a lifetime and that they build on. And you talk about the fact that that's the thing we need to get, because that's the thing that brings about bluntly the best version of the next generation in terms of well-developed children, well-rounded children, good members of society, happy, healthy, well-adjusted, not involved in crime, etc., etc. That's what brings kids about who are like that. So how do we reattach or reach out with our fingertips to that old transcendence, and how do we maybe rejuvenate it? What would you tell us?
Right. Well, minimally, don't let go of it. Right. People are thinking that politics is replacing transcendence, and so in Cheap Sex, I had talked about. I was trying to explain, I think it was, why progressive women in the United States just were more discouraged, depressed, and they were not sexually fulfilled. Okay, even though like they had all the tools, so I'd say, oh, this I like this, and they weren't liking it, right? And no matter what control I put in there, until we controlled for sort of religiosity, this thing remained, this sort of longing remained there. And so they were basically replacing the sort of the yearning for the transcendent with, oh, I can fulfill this in my relationships with men or even women. And it's just not true, right? And so once you understood, like, oh, what they're missing is this, the yearning for transcendence is about sort of the relationship they have with their maker, right? God, church. That's sort of, those are sort of super real entities, not sort of, if I just can meet this particular person, or have a successful relationship with them, I will be fulfilled. Like, nope, it still will not scratch that itch. We are trying to scratch that itch through the body, right? And what we can do with it. And it just is, that's not what brings us happiness.
The idea that, well, I'm going to be faithful to a person, not just because that person's always being loving and kind and beautiful, because those things will change over time, but because the idea of being faithful for life is itself a wonderful transcendent idea. And so you're doing it for the sake of the bigger thing, even though actually in the moment it might not always serve you particularly. You'll want to go and do something else. Yet you've got this other transcendent idea. This makes sense in a bigger frame, in a bigger picture. It's very, very good, Mark. It's very, very useful. Great. Listen, hopefully you're working on other great stuff that we'll read and we'll talk about in the near future. But can I thank you for your time? Keep up the great work. Professor Mark Regnerus, such a joy to talk to you.
Thank you, Tommy.